So, good morning, everyone, and I'll try and be brief because I know it's nearly lunchtime. Today, I'm going to be chatting to you about product management, cognitive bias, and you. As Sean said, I'm Carlo Kruger. I'm the designated driver at Unboxed Consulting in Cape Town. And my story starts in the late 90s, just after the death of grunge and before trance parties really took off in Cape Town. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine which went something like this. I said to him, I get evolution. I do. I can see it work. I can see that progression of species going forward. But what troubles me is I don't see how it explains consciousness. I don't understand how we evolved into thinking, feeling humans. To which Anthony replied, read these guys. So it started with a book by Daniel Dennett, who's a philosopher. He wrote a book called Consciousness Explained, which built extensively on the work of Richard Dawkins back when he was a biologist and not known as a self-involved atheist douchebag. But it was really Steven Pinker's book, and he's a linguist of all things, talking about how the mind works that broke me. These are the three horsemen of my intellectual apocalypse. And what it did for me was it brought about an inescapable revelation that our minds really are the product of evolution and all that implies given the history of our species. It led to a lifelong interest for me in cognitive science, a detour studying philosophy of mind, in fact, for a couple of years. So fast forward 15 years or so, and I'm working as an agile coach, trying to implement Scrum in large organizations. And what I started realizing was that it seemed to be really, really difficult to build products. It's hard. It really seems very hard. Nobody seems to have cracked the product management problem. For every Apple that there is out there, there are thousands and thousands of products that fall by the wayside. Good products, but they just never seem to make it. And so, in thinking about that, it struck me that the stuff that I had learned studying philosophy of mind and cognitive science had some application towards this because, well, these were humans that were trying to build products. So, like a good scientist, let me start off by defining my terms. What is cognitive bias? The simplest definition I've come across is innate psychological tendencies that cause us to draw incorrect conclusions. And really, the science of cognitive science starts in a very unlikely place, namely behavioral economics, with the work of Tversky and Kahneman's landmark work from 1972. If you go and read the book Thinking Fast and Slow, which is one of the latest by Kahneman, he talks about System 1 and System 2 thinking. So Thing 1 and Thing 2. System 1 is is basically our default operating system. It operates automatically and with very little effort. System 2, on the other hand, allocates attention to difficult mental activities. These are the things that are associated with agency, with choice, with concentration. It's metabolically expensive to think in System 2 thinking. And as a result, what our brain is actually trying to do is maximize the use of its available energy. So it offloads as much as it can to System 1 so that you only really have access to System 2 thinking when it's important. So if you think about it, an example of this, when you start learning to drive a car, it's very hard. It takes a lot of concentration. All those moving bits you need to think about. These days, if like me, you've been driving for 15, 20 years, then it's almost automatic. You find yourself at home without any conscious memory of what happened between when you left work and when you got home. That is System 1 thinking at its metabolically optimum. So what is your brain? What is your mind? Your mind is nothing less than a jump to conclusions mat. Your brain will always default to thinking in System 1 terms, and so you have to be aware of what the impact of that is. So let's take a look at some of the biases. The IKEA effect. If you can think about it, something as simple as starlings and rats show preferences for food that require effort to obtain. What this means for us is that labor leads to love. We have an innate bias towards things that we have labored upon, particularly things that we have completed, and it runs incredibly deep for us. Now, how did this bias get its name? Dan Ariely, who some of you may know from his TED Talks, is a behavioral economist, and he and his team gave some college students $5 to participate in a study. And in the study, they had to assemble this IKEA box. And at the end of it, they would ask them how much would they be willing to pay to keep that box. And you had amounts in sort of around $3 or so. They took a different group of college students and gave them $5 and asked them what they would pay for an already completed box. And that was about $1. And they repeated this experiment with origami. So they got some students, paid them $5, and got them to fold an origami frog. And if you've never had any kind of instruction in origami, that's a pretty tough thing to get right the first time around. And then they asked them how much they would be willing to pay for their origami frog, which was about $3. And they took a different group of college students and asked them how much they would be willing to pay for the frogs that had been folded by those students, which was about $1. And finally, they got some expert origami masters to fold some origami frogs and presented the choice to the students for how much they would be willing to pay for this expertly assembled and folded origami frog. Those people who had shown a preference for their own frogs valued their frogs approximately the same as those folded by the experts. Hence the name the IKEA effect. The IKEA effect is fundamentally that we have an irrational attachment to anything that we have been part of building. Labor leads to love. I've been to Vietnam twice now, and it's a fascinating country. One of the things that amuses me about it is that in Vietnam, they refer to it as the American War. The American War, for me, epitomizes the second cognitive bias, which is the sunk cost fallacy. To give you an idea of what the Vietnam War was like, Operation Rolling Thunder lasted from the 2nd of March 1965 until the 2nd of November 1968. That was basically a continuous bombing run over northern Vietnam on a daily basis. During the course of the entire Vietnam War, something like 6.7 million tons of bomb were dropped on Vietnam. By comparison, during the Second World War, 2.7 million tons of bomb were dropped on Germany. Writing after the war, Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara stated that by spring 1967, he and other civilians in the administration had become convinced that Rolling Thunder and the ground war in southern Vietnam was not working. In fact, Lyndon Johnson's escalation of the war in Vietnam divided Americans into warring camps, cost 30,000 American lives by the time he left office, and destroyed Johnson's presidency and McNamara's tenure as the Secretary of Defense. Despite this, Nixon continued the war in Vietnam and indeed re-upped it by approving additional bombing campaigns, Linebacker 1 and 2. So there you have it, the sunk cost fallacy. And another way of describing it is a dysfunctional relationship, dysfunctional commitment. If you think about it, our bias here is demonstrated when we find ourselves facing a choice between investing further in an existing project or using the money that we would have committed to that existing project and using it on something new. And everyone falls into this trap. Investors decide not to cash out on losing stocks in the hope that it will recover. instead of taking that money out and putting it into a stock that is rising. You may be stuck in a dysfunctional relationship with someone, but because you've been with them for such a long time, you decide to continue staying with them despite everything that your friends are telling you. So yeah, a very, very powerful cognitive bias on our part. The bandwagon effect is more of a social bias than a cognitive bias. But really what this means is for a group of people that are working on something together, they tend to reinforce each other's opinions. This is very close to the not invented here syndrome that is endemic in the technical community. Nothing is ever as good as the stuff that we've built here. Sound familiar? Anyone who's had to take over a project written by someone else, this is just crap. Our brains are telling us that this is true because it's something that has happened outside of our social group. So I wanted to talk about something that happened to me when I joined Unboxed. I joined Unboxed in April of 2012, and I was introduced to an unloved and unlovable internal product, our timesheet application. To give you a little bit of software archaeology, it was developed 9 years ago in Rails 1 by an inexperienced developer. And let's take it for granted that it was probably better than the set of Excel sheets they were passing around at the time. But since then, it's been extensively customized and extended. It is now far beyond just a mere timesheeting application. It's turned into an enterprise resource planning application because it has now got concepts of holidays, it's got concepts of invoicing. But it had a history that whenever anybody didn't have any time, they would work on this application. Whenever we got interns in, they'd get to work on timesheets. And whenever the new guy started and no one had figured out what he would be working on, timesheets. It's buggy as all hell because it's been around such a long time and it's been hacked on and hacked over, and there's lots of swearing in the comments and commits. And so the first question I had when I started there and saw this ugly beast was, well, why aren't we using Harvest? Now, our CEO, Richard Stobart, is a charismatic fellow. So I was initially swayed by his arguments, but what blew my mind was the idea that he had of turning our timesheet application into a product. And not only that he could compete with Harvest using this internal application. After I had removed myself from Richard's influence and thought about it some more, I realized something. The story of our timesheet application has every single one of the 3 cognitive biases that I've just discussed embedded in its history. What we've done there is we've made a decision to start building a product. We've fallen in love with it because it's complete. It's better than anything else out there. And we continue to spend money on it, extending and trying to fix all of those bugs because we want to release it into the marketplace. This is cognitive bias writ large. So now, that's kind of gloomy, right? Our brains are screwing us over. What do we have to defend ourselves against this? So, the best tool we have to eliminate emotion and cognitive bias is the scientific method. It's the best thing we've got so far. Does anyone know the story of how the scientific method became the scientific method? So René Descartes, I think therefore I am, that dude, the Descartes dude, was whoring and drinking his way through Europe when he had an angelic vision. And the angel appeared to him and said, "The conquest of nature is achieved through measurement and number." And Descartes went, "Yes, science." And then an endless profession of philosophers have been thinking about this, from Plato and Aristotle through Francis Bacon, Wittgenstein, Mill, Hume. Is this a Monty Python joke? Culminating in Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper, who equip us with a very powerful toolkit. In particular, Karl Karl Popper gives us a line in the sand about what defines what science can and cannot do. The term falsifiable here does not mean something is made false, but rather that if it is false, it can be shown by observation or experiment. The process of theory, hypothesis, attempt to falsify, and iterate is at the core of how science works in the real world. And if you were paying attention during Phil's keynote, and he's talking about lean UX, fundamentally what we're doing is we're bringing those concepts of theory, hypothesis, test, experiment, and iterate into the domain of user experience. So let's just quickly take a look at some of the UX practices that we have available to us that have brought a little bit of science to the art of project management, product management. If we put our products in front of real users before they're done, we can avoid the IKEA effect. Because one of the critical things that happens with the IKEA effect is that you have to have completed something in order for you to gain that emotional attachment to it. So, if you're putting this in front of real users before it's done, they're going to break it, and as a result improve the user experience, but at the same time, it also makes it possible for you to short-circuit that emotional attachment. And really, the concepts of minimum viable product and lean product development are at the core of improving incrementally through usability testing and ultimately through actually getting interaction with the real application. So you get early feedback, you avoid your cognitive bias. Great. A/B testing is a variant of usability testing, you could say, but here what you're doing is you're using the actual working version on your website to try and figure out what works best for you. The nice thing about A/B testing, which came out of our talk yesterday around metrics and measurement, is that you can't shout at a number. Numbers don't lie, or do they? We'll get back to that. But here's an incredibly powerful toolkit that's using concepts of metrics to get around emotional arguments about success. And then finally, the one that I really, really like is cheap prototyping. Cheap prototyping short circuits the sunk cost fallacy, because if it's cheap, you haven't spent a lot of money on it, you get to fail, you get to change your mind, and it doesn't cost as much, and no one's feelings are going to get hurt as a result of that. So cool, right? Right? So we're all good. We've overcome our cognitive biases through the use of UX practices. We've brought some science to this decision-making process. We're making better product decisions. We head off into the sunsets with our awesome products. Not so fast. There are some cognitive biases that work against these practices also. Hawthorne effect. Anyone familiar with it? So for those of you that don't know the story, in the dawn of management science, time and motion studies were considered the gold standard for helping people figure out how to get more out of their workers. And at the Hawthorne factory, one of the things they wanted to experiment with were light levels in the factory. So step one, isolate two groups of women who are building widgets, and one of them you increase the light levels and the other you leave as a control group. And no shit, they built more widgets. Awesome. But, you know, increasing your light levels is expensive, so they wanted to also experiment with the converse, which is they lowered light levels, and lo and behold, they made more widgets. And what they've discovered is that the attention that those women were getting from the nice boss that was caring about their light levels was actually the root cause for them making more widgets. And now, this is actually a cluster of cognitive biases. There's the experimenter bias, there's the subject bias. So the subject of any investigation will try to please the experimenter during that process. And something which Marco mentioned in his talk about make sure you don't ask them how it's going during your focus group or during your usability testing is incredibly important, because they will try to please you by reporting that it works, it's great. Fundamental attribution error. Chief Wiggum, by the way, is my favorite Simpsons character, and what the chief is actually experiencing here is the exact opposite of fundamental attribution error. If you're driving along and someone's driving like a douchebag, your immediate assumption is that he's a douchebag. But in fact, he could be driving someone to the hospital, he could be in some kind of other emergency. The fundamental attribution error is people's tendency to place an undue emphasis on internal characteristics to explain someone else's behavior in a given situation. So we're much more likely to blame the person rather than the set of circumstances that they find themselves in. Again, this is more applicable to qualitative testing than quantitative testing because of the experimenter's bias. If you're more likely to blame the person rather than the circumstance, that's going to be a problem for you. The other thing which is even more of a problem due to the fundamental attribution error is that you tend to exhibit it to a greater degree when you're under cognitive load, i.e. when you have less motivation or energy for processing situational information. If you're stressed out, if you're already busy with something else, or if you're just thinking very, very hard, you're more likely to blame the person rather than the environment. Confirmation bias. We don't like being contradicted in our opinions. And it goes deeper than that. When we create hypotheses, when we ask questions of people involved in qualitative studies, our tendency is to try and confirm our already existing opinion rather than asking the question in a way that would allow our opinion to be contradicted. The effect is stronger for emotionally charged issues and for deeply entrenched beliefs. So the more attached you are to your product, the more you're going to exhibit this cognitive bias. In the realm of quantitative information, you're also more likely to pay attention to metrics that confirm your opinion rather than disproving it. And this also plays a role in the creation of deciding what to measure, or the creation of any kind of questions that you want to. So the survey design plays a big role in whether or not confirmation bias may affect the results. It's also not limited to the collection of evidence. Even if two individuals have the same information, the way they interpret it can be biased. The implications for us is that the more that we love our products, the more likely we are to notice information that confirms our own hypotheses. So, digital product development is hard. It's hard because we have brains that have basically evolved to tell each other where the good fruit is. It hasn't been evolved to work in complex environments, solving complex problems in a digital domain. Our brains are adapted to expend the least amount of effort possible, as cognition is metabolically expensive, and as a result, we have a tendency to fall prey to our cognitive biases. Here's the kicker. It's basically impossible to remove all cognitive bias. Basically, you're up against the fundamental nature of your brain and the way that it consumes energy. And so you're going to be relying on your System 1 thinking more often than you are on System 2 thinking. So what can we do to try and overcome these things? So gather facts. It's hard to know if you're improving if you're not measuring. Create a structure for making decisions. Define clear criteria to evaluate the merits of each option and then use them consistently. Be mindful of subtle cues, who's included and who's been excluded, and foster awareness. So hold yourself and your colleagues accountable to these things that I've just discussed. And then the best advice that I have for you is do it in the morning. If you have to make difficult decisions, you have more energy available in the morning. Each decision that you make throughout the day, in fact, diminishes your capacity for slow thinking. Your best decisions are made in the morning. And that's me, short and sweet. Any questions?
Hi. Is there anything you can do to make the system one thinking smarter, to make your subconscious thinking more like your conscious thinking?
No. Unfortunately, really, so if you go to the Wikipedia page on cognitive bias, there are over 100. And we're discovering more of them as we go along. And I think what you're up against is a fundamental structure in our brain. Really what you have to do is you have to rely on others to help you identify when you're falling victim to a cognitive bias. Something like meditation and mindfulness will probably help you identify emotional responses so that you can pay attention to that also.